Well, you will be after today.
Did you turn it back on?
Bring it back on right now.
Well, it's on. It's on. Okay. All set?
We're all set.
Good morning. My name is Chris Baird. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Duke Law Journal, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to our 35th Annual Administrative Law Conference. Every conference is organized a little bit differently. Some are organized to take place over an entire day with multiple breakout sessions and keynote speakers. We wanted to do a little something different here. Our goal was to bring together 4 really sharp people and 1 really sharp moderator to discuss some cutting-edge issues and to hopefully generate some good ideas along the way with you in connection with them. Our topic this morning, very broadly conceived, is the internet and agency decision-making. It was inspired by a dissenting opinion by Commissioner Copps in the recent FCC rulemaking about media ownership caps. In that dissent, Commissioner Copps said, "I want to thank the hundreds of thousands of people who have attended hearings, filed comments, written letters to the editor, and contacted the Commission. You have made a difference. And if you stay the course now, we have a chance to settle this issue of who will control our media and for what purposes, and to resolve it in favor of public airways of, by, and for the people of this great country." Given that quote, we started asking the question of what is an agency to do with hundreds of thousands or even millions of comments in response to a notice of proposed rulemaking? How does such a large volume of comments change the process and the substance of rulemaking? These are some of the questions that we hope will be addressed today. We're very grateful to have such a distinguished panel to discuss these issues. On the far end, we have Professor Cary, Associate Professor of Public Policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. His most recent work, titled The Internet and Citizen Participation in Rulemaking, is directly on point, and he's one of the foremost experts in the field. He has braved both storms and canceled flights to be here early this morning, and we're very happy to have him. To his right, and I'm sorry, I guess he was on the far right, to his right is Zephyr Teachout. She's a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. She is the former director of online organizing for Dean for America, the Howard Dean campaign, and she's the former editor-in-chief of the Duke Law Journal. To her right is Professor John Figueiredo. He's an associate professor of strategic management at the Sloan School of Management at MIT, and he's currently visiting at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. His research mainly focuses on corporate legislative and regulatory lobbying behavior, mainly in the field of e-commerce and the high-tech sector. To his right is Professor Michael Froomkin. He's a professor of law at the University of Miami Law School. He teaches courses in internet law, law of e-commerce, and administrative law. His writings are often at the forefront of the interaction between law and technology, and he has his own blog at www.discourse.net. And I believe he was just blogging a second ago about this conference to all his students back in Miami. Our moderator today is our very own Stuart Benjamin. His research and teaching focuses mainly on telecommunications law, the First Amendment, and administrative law. The 2 last people I'd like to thank, first I'd like to thank all our panelists and our moderator, but 2 other groups I'd like to thank are the American Constitution Society and Dewey Ballantine. They both kicked in a fair amount of cash for us to have this event, and we're very pleased with that. I hope you will join me in welcoming our moderator and our panelists. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm going to talk about the growing interest in citizen participation in the rulemaking process as it's reflected in some current efforts within the Bush administration, although they predate even the Bush administration, efforts to bring rulemaking online, bring rulemaking into the digital age. The current administration has developed in January 2003 a website called regulations.gov. If you haven't been there already, it is an online portal that takes you to all of the rules that are open for public comment across the entire federal government, and you can, from that one stop, find the rule and file a comment on it. The administration is going into its second phase of its e-rulemaking initiative by developing a federal docket management system which will allow any person anywhere in the country 24/7 to get access to the background dockets and all of the rulemaking studies and reports and public comments and all of the materials that previously had been hidden away in file cabinets in obscure offices of regulatory agencies in Washington, D.C., and make them all available to everyone. Now, both of these efforts, both regulations.gov and the Federal Docket Management System, are explicitly designed to enhance and increase citizen participation in the rulemaking process. If you look at the statements by President Bush, by his OMB director, by the lead managers at the Environmental Protection Agency that are administering these efforts, they will all tell you, all these statements say that these are designed to increase citizen participation in the rulemaking process. Now, I want to suggest today that that's a significant departure or a significant new direction, actually, for administrative law. That traditionally administrative law has given, I think, relatively weak emphasis on citizen participation. The Administrative Procedure Act, 1946, certainly provides for the public to have an opportunity to comment on proposed rules, but it doesn't really specify what that comment process should be, how long it should be. It doesn't command that agencies really engage with these comments. In fact, the APA simply says that the agency must, quote, consider relevant material. That's a very weak commitment and obligation, I would submit, to citizen participation. And even the reformation of administrative law that Dick Stuart wrote about in the 60s and 70s was a reformation in public access for, in his terms, interest groups, not really citizens, not ordinary citizens. Moreover, we have an underlying theme throughout administrative law that the obligation for administrative agencies is to make decisions and justify them based upon reasons. And I see this as in tension with an alternative way of looking at administrative decision making, reflected by the dissenting opinion by the FCC commissioner, that really what the administrative process should be is responsive to citizen preferences, responsive to politics. But actually, one of the leading decisions by the Supreme Court in the field of administrative law, the State Farm decision, specifically resists the pull of politics as a motivating force for administrative decision making. It says it really must be reason. That case, if you remember, involved the Reagan administration coming in and rescinding a prior rule requiring passive restraints in automobiles. And the Supreme Court said, just the change of administration by itself, just the change in politics is not sufficient for an administrative agency to make some regulatory decision, in that case a rescission. That what the courts demand is reason giving rather than just deference to politics. Now, question, maybe this is a fine strategy to take in 1946 or 1982, that is to emphasize reason giving, emphasize administrative agencies searching for the public interest. But is it still an appropriate strategy to take in an electronic age when 250,000 or 500,000 members of the public can file comments now on proposed rules? Shouldn't there be, if we're committed to democracy and democratic governance, shouldn't there be some basis for thinking that citizen participation should be both encouraged and that it could even be a basis for, a grounds for administrative agencies to make decisions? Again, as the FCC dissenting opinion suggested, that it should make a difference. Well, I think there's certainly a strong pull and certainly a good case to be made that administrative agencies and their decisions ought to be citizen-centered, okay, that they should be motivated by thinking about how their rules will affect citizens. But we need to step back before we say that agencies ought to take the comments that they receive and use those as a basis for making its decisions. Let me just postulate an ideal case. An ideal case, if the agency has a policy choice between policy A and policy B, both which fall within the confines of a reasonable interpretation of the statute, neither of which would violate constitutional or statutory rights. In an ideal case, if an agency could have a high level of confidence that more Americans preferred A, say, than to B, that would, in my view, be a sufficient reason for choosing A over B. But now, how can you square this with the traditional administrative law preference for reason giving rather than democratic accountability? Well, I think it's because this would be an ideal case in which all citizens and all of their preferences could be taken into account. In fact, there is a good bit of administrative law that suggests that's exactly what agencies should do. Requirements under executive orders and now under statute for agencies to engage in benefit cost analysis forces agencies, in a sense, to go out and add up who's benefiting and who's losing from a policy and looking across all of society. So the basic reason that I would suggest the administrative law doctrine should not encourage agencies to look at comments carefully is because we won't ever get that ideal case through the comment process. Unless we can be confident that commenters are representative of the larger public and a complete set of the public, we really should still continue to demand that public servants act with the interests of everyone in mind. And this is, it seems to me, a truly democratic approach because it respects the voices and the interests of non-participants as much as the participants. Even 500,000 comments is a small part of the entire population of the United States. It's even small compared with all of the people who voted, say, for President Reagan, which the court said that's not a sufficient basis for making administrative decisions. The comment process is, even in a digitized world, a reactive process. It's one in which people participate if they know about a rule, they know about the agency, they know when to comment, and they care about it. Is this going to lead to a representative sampling of the entire population? No, it won't. Now, some might say I'm asking too much to demand that the agency take into account everybody's interests. Shouldn't 500,000 people's voices really matter? Well, the problem is how do you get a sense of whether those 500,000 people are like all of the rest of the people? You might say, well, maybe they care more and their views should be taken into account more. Well, here's an interesting thing. As information technology makes it easier and easier for the public to comment, the fact that you comment is no longer as good of a signal that you care intensely about an issue. So the individual signaling value of filing a comment, if it's just an email dashed off or it's generated through some email campaign, actually probably provides a weaker signal about even the views of, say, an intense minority. So in the end, I don't think there's any getting around the fundamental limitations of using a reactive comment process as a basis for aggregating interests and using that as a basis for regulatory decision-making. Let me conclude by asking, does this mean that I think that the current efforts toward e-rulemaking are misguided? Well, yes, if you think that this is going to make the process more democratic, and if you think that agencies should take these voluminous comments that come in by email into account. But not necessarily misguided if you think, well, maybe it's healthy for 500,000 people to send in emails and get more involved in the process. And that maybe that's a good thing, even if it shouldn't affect the outcome all that much. Second, the more people you have participating, maybe it's more likely that someone will make a comment that's actually helpful and informative for the agency. And so that's a good reason to make it easier for people to participate through online processes. And finally, I think there is a reason to go ahead and digitize the rulemaking process, even though we shouldn't change or modify administrative law doctrine about public participation. And that is, it seems to me, it just makes sense for government to be accessible and reachable in the ways that people are used to communicating in their ordinary lives. Imagine if our government only allowed people to petition itself through telegrams. We would think that would be fairly odd, and probably we would wonder about the legitimacy of our government. So I think as society moves increasingly into a world in which we communicate electronically, that it does make some sense for agencies to allow people to comment that way as well. But again, merely digitizing the process, while it may be helpful and valuable, does not provide a sufficient basis for revising traditional administrative law doctrine.
Great. All right, continuing through the alphabet, John,
Yes, thank you.
do you need this?
Yes, I do need that. Thank you.
I think we have to turn around.
Yes, I'm going to use the PowerPoint presentation facility here. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm not a lawyer. I'm trained as an economist, and I do work on the FCC and look at interest group activity in the FCC. In particular, I look at the politics of regulation and in the telecommunications industry. What I'd like to talk about today is I'd like to talk about information interest groups and administrative law. And again, forgive me if I'm not as, don't have the lingo down. I kind of know the general concepts of the law, but I don't have the quite proper lingo. So the question we're going after here is, can electronic filing result in better rulemaking? So that's the question that I thought was a question that we should think about. What I want to do is I actually want to pose the question, and then I want to look at the data. So the NSF, the National Science Foundation, has sponsored a project of which Cary is a leader in the project, examining the efficacy of electronic rulemaking. And I perused these papers, and I found that they have many good ideas, but they don't have a lot of big data sets to look at these questions. And so what I've done is I've been trying to do that. So the Federal Communications Commission in 1998 moved toward more of e-filing, an electronic filing system for comments, replies, and ex parte presentations. And there are four main methods by which you can file at the FCC. The first is you can use what they call the Internet or Internet Expert. In essence, it's an online form that you fill out. So there's a form you fill out and you send it in, you hit the go button and it goes. The second is you can send an email. We know how to do that. The third is you can submit it by paper. And what happens is the FCC then subsequently scans it in to their electronic system. And then recently they implemented the ECFS system, which I don't know what that is, but it's new. Okay, so there's a reason I don't know what that is, because the data I have here was provided to me by Bill Klein, who's Director of Reference Information at the Federal Communications Commission. And I told him I was presenting at Duke, and he wanted to know when. I said, I'm presenting on the 25th. And he said, OK. And so I received the data at 6 p.m. on the 24th, right? And he said, good luck at the presentation tomorrow. OK, so let me start off. Let me show you some long-term trends about the FCC, long-term trends and how much they have and the number of filings they have. So this is just, so basically what they do is they get all this paper, or they get it electronically, and then they store it. And they store it all electronically. And what you see from 1992 to 2004, the top graph, the top left panel, shows the total number of filings that are coming into the FCC of all types. And it shows you that over time, you've seen an increase. The FCC's been more active, obviously. But there's not a big spike after 1996, when the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was passed. You get a big spike, though, at 2002, 3, and 4. Okay? So you got to increase the number of filings, but notice the number of pages in the bottom left panel is actually not increasing at the same rate. So the filings are getting shorter. That means you're getting more filings, but they're getting shorter filings, which suggests that people are not making these long filings they used to. You may actually be getting more individual participation in the filing process. I have some stuff here about image size, so we can measure this by pages or by the size of the file itself. So we can count the number of letters in the filing instances. And it's the same thing as the page counts. They're pretty flat, even though the number of filings are going up. So let's start off. Has electronic filing made a difference? So starting in 1998, when they moved to the electronic filing system, they started keeping monthly data. And so what I'm going to present now is the monthly data from 1998 to December 2004, when the data started becoming available on a monthly basis. And what you see is that the number of paper filings has been declining, is trending downward over time. This data, you see that 0 there in September, around September, October 2002. I think that's just a missing data point. It's not actually a 0. It may actually be a 0, but I haven't had time since I got it at 6 p.m. yesterday to analyze this data. So one effect you see is that electronic filing has caused the amount of paper coming into the FCC to decline over time, which is one of the expectations that people expected. Let's think about comments filed via the Internet Expert, so via the online documentation. This is what the number of filings that they have that have come in during via the Internet Expert from 1998 to 2000 and December 2004. And you look at that and you say, wow, there's not very many, except, whoa, what is that, right? What is that big spike, right? And we can look at that spike, and that is the media ownership rules, okay? So I know in the brochure we talked about the media ownership rules, and effectively, if you take out the media ownership rules, that looks just as flat as it was before, okay? So this is comments filed via the Internet Expert. This is important to recognize. I'm going to make a distinction in a second between different filing methods of filing comments. If we take out that data point and rescale the graph so we can kind of see what's going on below, that happens in this graph. And what you see is you see that there's more comments being filed over time via the Internet Expert, but you also get the second spike. You see it around September 2002 in the top graph, but it doesn't seem very big. And what's driving people to that spike is the anthrax scare. People don't want to send mail anymore, right? Because there's anthrax in the mail, right? And people are terrified. And what they do is they shift to Internet Expert filings. And what's interesting about, if you look at kind of time series data at the Internet, what's driving people to the Internet Expert is not, desire necessarily to participate, as we might think about it. It's these exogenous events, like the anthrax scare or some extreme event like media ownership rules that's actually causing this. Of course, the question arises, is that really 80,000 or 100,000 people talking about, do 100,000 people really care about media ownership rules? Let me discuss a second, category, or third category, which is the email, comments coming over email. This is what email commentary looks like over time. And you look at this graph and you say, well, there's some spikes in 2001, 2002. I can't explain those. Part of those are because of anthrax. We start emailing stuff in. But there's these two spikes in the 2004. The first, that's the media ownership rules, right? Again, we don't believe, I know some commissioners believe, but I don't believe, at least personally, that citizens cared so much about media ownership rules, like 100 times more than they care about any other issue before the FCC. But I do believe that there was another issue. You see that second spike. And that's a second spike that comes about. I do believe that citizens really did care about that second spike. The Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction, right? Okay, so here we have, disrobing at the Super Bowl, and I think citizens really do care about that, right? And so what you have to do is you have to be slightly careful when you look at these, because some of these are maybe just, interest groups like media companies hiring, minimum wage workers in China to send comments to the Internet Expert, as many as they can, right? And they accumulate 80,000 of them, versus this Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction, where actually it probably was really thousands and thousands of people really were incensed about the wardrobe malfunction in the Super Bowl. If we take those two out and we look at this again, you see this spike around September 2002, and that is also, I believe, due to some things related to the anthrax, but I can't say that definitively. Okay, that's some data. That's what's really going on in terms of the e-filing. I think it's important that when we talk about e-filing, we have to kind of identify what's going on. Imagine that there's two types of people. There are interest groups, kind of experts in interest groups, and there's individuals like you and I who may care about an issue. And there's two time periods. There's before there was electronic filing, and there's afterwards. So what's going on here? Well, it turns out interest groups are always involved at a moderate level in issues, that electronic filing doesn't really change the interest group participation in the electronic file, in the rulemaking process. But it does change it for individuals. It turns out individuals are more likely to participate, especially when they have a strong preference about an issue. I'm basically trying to say whether a group or individual files, so this is like the economist in me coming, I got to have a mathematical equation, right? What this basically says is that, look, the probability of filing is a function of how relevant or how much you care about the issue and the cost of a filing, right? So there's relevance R and cost C. And it turns out interest groups are always care because it's always relevant to them. There's huge stakes. So the fact that you made it lower cost to file doesn't affect interest group participation. But it does affect individual participation because individuals, you change the cost a little bit, and individuals who marginally cared about it are able to now shoot an email off rather than writing a letter. So you get a difference in individual participation, but the initial data seems to suggest you don't get a difference in interest group participation. So what does that mean substantively? Now here I did not know what Cary was going to say, but actually I'm going to come very close to what he's saying in this, and actually I think agree with what he's saying, is that interviewing people at the FCC, what they say is these 80,000 comments on media ownership or on pretty much any issue substantively provides very little guidance for rulemaking. It doesn't provide us, the substance of the emails don't give us much information. What they do give us is they do give us some information about the underlying preferences of citizens. So in his stylized example, you have A and B. It says I support A or I support B. And we get some kind of intuition as to, there are citizens who support this or that. So you get information through the quantity filed, but not through the actual substance of the email. So when you think of administrative rulemaking, the courts don't necessarily have to look at each email and say, did you respond in order to adhere to APA standards? Instead, most of these emails just are don't have much substance, they just state a position. This addresses Cary's comment regarding, this addresses about who are we seeing, right? So imagine there's an issue before the FCC right now on should we allow cell phones on planes, right? Okay, so now who's going to file under a non-electronic system when it's high cost? As Cary was pointing out, what you're going to get frequent flyers filing, right? You're going to get these people who basically fly all the time, they care a lot about the issue. But notice that they may be a very small segment of the flying population. If you care about the broader population, that is, there are many more non-frequent flyers as a group than there are frequent flyers. However, any individual person flies a lot less than a frequent flyer. You actually may want to include their opinions because they reflect most of the plane. And therefore, by lowering the cost, you actually pick up this entire group by making it cheaper for them to file. It's now cheap for a non-frequent flyer to file, a moderate flyer to file. You're still going to miss, as Cary notes, you're still going to miss these very infrequent flyers because these guys don't fly enough at all. And so you're not going to get a fully representative democratic sample, but you are going to pick up a larger portion of the sample. And I think that's an important thing to think about when you think about rulemaking. So I think it helps you to understand the preference structure, may help the FCC to derive outcomes. One small note I just wanted, it's a little bit of a digression, is maybe you think that these electronic filing systems don't really affect, maybe they don't really affect the rulemaking, but they affect the quality of deliberation. That is, if I can access things electronically, what I can do is I can view the opposing comments. I'm more likely to respond. I'm more likely to have higher quality arguments. And if you saw something like that, what you would expect is if you believe that argument was happening, what you would expect is I think, on some level, that you would be viewing more of these comments more frequently. You'd be kind of using this electronic system to see more and more comments. This is the number of hits on the electronic filing system, at the FCC from 1998 to December 2004. And what you see is it's not trending upwards. Even though we've provided an electronic filing system starting in 1998, actually it's been somewhat flat. It's slightly trending upwards. That is, we are using more of the electronics, but we're not using a lot more of it, as one might expect. And so this argument about deliberation, the data suggests we don't know if that's a true argument, but it's worth, I think, investigating further. I think if I had more than 3 hours to look at this data and put it into a PowerPoint presentation, I would have more substantive conclusions, but I think at this point it's premature. I should say there's the anthrax scare, arising from the ashes, and causing people to go online more often, starting in September of 2002 and lasting about a year. So the spike you see there is people just afraid to go in to the FCC and look at documents because they might be lined with anthrax. So this then comes to the fundamental problem I see. If it gives you better information about preference structure of citizens, maybe you want to include them. The problem is, how do you know that they're genuine? How do you know the comments are not made by these minimum wage workers in China that are paid to just generate email and send them through a United States host, or use the internet expert and just generate thousands of comments, tens of thousands of comments about media ownership rules, right? We go back to that media ownership rules. I do believe it was Janet Jackson was a public outrage. I don't believe media ownership rules was. And so that's a question, how do you know it's genuine? And I don't have an answer for that. But you could imagine that there might be technical mechanisms, there may be legal mechanisms, there may be identification mechanisms, authentication mechanisms. But I think it's interesting to think about how, if it does get you better outcomes, it may be best to think about how to ensure what you're seeing is genuine and not just kind of made up stuff. So in summary, I think that electronic filing has resulted in increased participation in some issues at the FCC in terms of individuals. There's not much change in interest group participation if you talk to the people there. There's a lot of change in individual participation. What's causing people to move to this, though, is not all of these theoretical ideas that we have about democracy and participation. It's I'm scared about anthrax. I'm outraged about Janet Jackson. It's not about, I'm keeping track of all these little issues now much more closely, and I'm filing. And that's kind of the ideal world, but the data doesn't suggest that is happening, that we just kind of move along, and then occasionally some issue happens and we just get really upset about it, and we file. I want to also stress, I think with Cary, that individual participation can be informative. People at the FCC tell me that the substance is not, but you do get an underlying thing in the preference structure. And if you care about democratic participation in the rulemaking process, that might be a good thing, but you have to be concerned about the genuineness. And so fundamentally, I think it's useful to bring the data to the arguments and say, what do these arguments predict before we go out and revamp a whole electronic filing system? I think it's useful to think about those kinds of issues because we have an experiment that has occurred at the FCC, and if you have predictions about what should happen given various policies, they can be tested with the data at the FCC. Thank you.
Dr. Froomkin.
Thank you. I've written elsewhere, and I think it may be this remark that got me invited here, that so far, at least at the federal level, the use of the internet for administrative rulemaking has really consisted almost entirely of doing old things better rather than doing new things. And I think I still believe that today. It's possible that the amount of information sharing, the amount of stuff that's now on the web, has become such a difference in degree that it's almost a change in kind because it makes participation for people outside the Beltway much more on an even plane than with people inside. So certainly if you're going to be doing more analysis for your data, if there's any way to find out where the people were who were commenting, that would be really interesting to know in a way, because is it all Beltway groups, or is it, how dispersed is it? That would be an interesting fact, because certainly when I try this out on my students in Florida, one of the things they say is, oh no, this internet thing really makes a difference because we don't have to go through Washington people to go to the library to get us the material. We can do it ourselves, and that's a big difference to our practices and to our ability to think about things in a timely way. I'm going to tell you 3 stories today, which I call noses, spam, and bloggers. And then I'm going to give you 3 thoughts that grow somewhat out of those stories, or at least so I'm going to claim. Here's the first story, all right, the noses question. It's the thing that's, I think, common to maybe all of our talks today. And it's about the Forest Service. It turns out that the Forest Service is the agency in Washington which perhaps has had the most intensive relationship with commentators. And it's an interesting story. It goes back to the Clinton administration. Here is an account of a Clinton insider about a Forest Service rulemaking for the roadless areas rules. He wrote, Michael Dombeck, an advisor of Michael Dombeck wrote, a record-breaking 600 local meetings and 2.2 million postcards, letters, emails, and faxes, an astonishing 95% supporting stronger protection of roadless areas, serve as a testament, Instead of preparing canned and trite responses that neatly fitted a preordained conclusion, the Forest Service allowed public sentiment to shape the outcome and content of the rule, affirming the value of public involvement in the management of public lands. Never before, and never likely again, will a federal proposal receive such widespread public support. Sounds great. Then you get the alternate view, summarized in Jim Rossi's amazingly beautifully titled article, Participation Run Amok: The Cost of Mass Participation to Deliberative Agency Decision-Making. And right there you have the tension that's at the heart of all these things. Are we just counting noses, or are we engaged in some sort of deliberation, traditional ideas of agency expertness, and so on? Well, let's continue with the Forest Service. In the Bush administration, the Forest Service, reacting, I think, to this history of mass participation, decided to issue a proposed rule which contained the following language. Only original substantive comments that meet objection content requirements set out in the next paragraph will be accepted. Form letters, checkoff lists, pre-printed postcards, or similar duplicative materials will not be accepted as objections. In other words, we don't want any of this noses stuff. We just want stuff with content, and we're going to filter somehow to throw it away. Now, this led to a firestorm of protest by interest groups, one of which I helped draft, and it was not, in fact, put into the final rule. And they said, oh, yes, we counted everything. But this really leads to sort of interesting questions. First off, why would the agency not want to have the information? Perhaps because they're afraid they're going to do something that people really don't like and don't want to make a record of that. And that's interesting because that gives you, a possible answer to why interest groups bother to whip up the troops to participate in these processes at all. After all, as an abstract matter, there are three possible reasons. One is they think it'll change the agency's mind. Right? The second is they think it may influence Congress in some way. So if the agency does something that is inconsistent with what appears to be the popular will, Congress might step in and correct the agency. And the third is a cynical view that it doesn't matter because it whips up the troops and increases interest and affiliation with the organization. If the comments result in the agency adopting the policy proposed, see, we won one, aren't we great? Let's all stay together. And if not, we lost, send us more money so we can fight a better fight next time. So, but if the agency doesn't want the information to be on the record, that sort of suggests that there's more than the cynical view going on here. That the agency has a problem with people knowing just how unpopular their policy are. And that's sort of interesting. It's also interesting the agency backed down. Before you get too comfortable with the idea of the noble citizen groups and the evil Forest Service trying to stop all the public comment, I do have to share with you that in my research for this, I came across the website for the Healthy Forests campaign, which was opposing this change in the rule, which would have stopped comments being counted multiple times. And they said, all you need to do to fight this is to hit the reply button to send a message to Chief Bosworth. And if you'd like to personalize your campaign, please go to www.actioncenter.org/campaign/spam. That's truth in advertising. Somebody somewhere there has sort of a somewhat cynical view of what they're engaged in themselves. Well, that brings me to the question of spam and spam filters, because in the Forest Service, again, in this same process at some point, decided, as many agencies have done, they're not alone in this, that they had a problem with when they publish an email address online, they get spam just like everybody else does. And believe me, I'm sympathetic. I'm getting about 2,000 spams a day myself right now. It's a very, imagine how much worse it probably is for the government. And they decided to put in some kind of spam filter, which apparently wasn't brilliantly designed. I mean, a lot of spam filters use heuristics, and if you're getting the same content over and over again is flagged as spam, and I suspect that's what happened with the Forest Service. And therefore, some of these mass-generated texts were being flagged as duplicative spam and being returned to the sender with a message saying, gee, we haven't taken your thing because we think it's spam. The bounce back message didn't include any information about how to get an override. It turned out that there was a phone number you could call to get a code to put in your subject line that says, I'm really not spam, let me through. But they didn't tell citizens about this. They also, the Forest Service here, it's a little bit suspicious. They stayed out as far away as possible from all the centralized commenting things they could. They wanted to have their unique system that was not accessible from the main government pages. So their motives are questionable here. But the result was a large number of people in the interest groups complaining that they tried to send in comments, they had been bounced back. They, of course, sent them in at the last minute, so by the time they figured out, the override rule needed to be publicized, it was too late to send them in. And there's a great deal of angst. Again, there's a dark side here. Because in addition to spamming the official comment address, which of course clogs up the works and makes it hard for the agency to actually come through and find the comments that they ought to be counting, there was a group called Forest Service Employees for Environmental Ethics, which got a hold of the entire internal agency email list and decided to send emails to everybody in the Forest Service. So 27,000 agency employees all got an email about this. And when this made news that the entire agency had been spammed, interest groups got the idea of requesting that they, under the Freedom of Information ideas, the entire list, they got them somehow. I don't know if they got them from the agency or from this other group. And that led to over 1 million emails being sent to the agency list from interest groups as a form of lobbying. Maybe not the smartest thing to do to put people in a good mood. So there is there are some real interesting issues there about how you filter the text so that you get whatever it is you think you ought to have, even before you get to the question what weight you ought to put on it and what weight you do put on it, which may or may not be the same thing. Now, let me get to my third story, government bloggers. It's slightly a misnomer because the ones I know about are really people with web pages rather than interactive pages like blogs, but there are people in the bureaucracy. The best example by far, I think, is the FCC's Douglas Galby, who's an economist who has a great page called galbythink.org, in which he publishes basically academic papers about issues involving communications policy, and it's really interesting to read. And it tells you something about what somebody inside the agency is thinking. And I look at this thing and I think, gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if there were more people in decision-making roles or in policy analytical roles who are really giving us a sort of a window into their thinking. Then, of course, the next step is, could it be interactive? Could the public, and now Galby goes to conferences, so people interact with him, at places like TPRC, but, lots of people don't go to those things. Could there be some sort of forum in which interested members of the public could interact with mid-level people, upper or lower level, but whoever it might be who's got responsibility for these decisions, and wouldn't that be great? Now, there's some significant ex-parte issues here, as well as the possibility of, people pretending to be what they're not. So there's a lot of data quality issues there and legal issues, which I think we haven't thought through at all clearly. And then, of course, there's a political reality that at least in the corporate sector, lots of people lose their jobs for this kind of behavior. I mean, last week was this, or 2 weeks ago, this guy was fired from a bookstore in England, in Waterstones, because he'd made some disparaging comment about his manager. And, you think about the whole issues of self-censorship and then external censorship. I mean, it's a whole new uncharted territory, which is not going to be that easy to sort out. Okay, I promise you 3 sort of conclusions somewhat tenuously connected to these stories. Here they are. The first is trite, but probably the most important, and that is that implementation matters enormously. The way in which you design these things, the ways in which if you decide we can't have anonymity, you design something which nonetheless may protect people against any adverse consequences they may feel they have in participating. The ways in which you make, if you have a spam blocker, you give it an easy override, which doesn't nonetheless open it up for spammers themselves to take advantage of it. These are tough design issues sometimes, which as far as I can tell haven't been thought about hardly at all in the government sector. Beth Novak's done some interesting writing in this area, but there's a lot left to do, and it really matters. The second point is that in the literature that I care about, there's a lot of discussion about ways of making discourse better in groups, about the ways in which electronic tools can either help groups form offline or more commonly help them form online and structure discussions that are moderated, that are sensible, that are goal-oriented perhaps, that might lead to consensus or decision or objective or whatever. And again, Beth Novak's written a lot of great stuff there. One thing that's quite striking about those tools to me, though, is that by and large they do not scale. They really are based on relatively small numbers of people. Now, those people may be regular people. They may be people who are somehow representative. We may dress them up with lovely names like citizen advisory boards, working groups, virtual juries, all kinds of great things. But the fact is that the number of participants with the tools we have still has to be pretty small, or things fall apart fast. So a really important social goal, if we want to extend this to anything national, is to figure out new ways of having conversations among large numbers of people. And I have yet to see a tool deployed that I had confidence in. So I'm not even sure I know what it would look like. And that's a really big problem. And that leads me to my third, rather, I guess, most speculative observation. And that is, I wonder if we might not be heading into a period in which local and maybe state administrative law will diverge even more than it has in the past from federal. Because the tools do work for smaller groups. And therefore, ideas of what processes do, what kind of agency decision is reasonable, what constitutes rationality, when it's right to count noses and so on, may be really different for smaller groups in which these tools actually are on tap, and once they do become used. And this would be consistent with ideas floating around internationally about administrative law and constitutional governance, like the European concept of subsidiarity, where you want to push decisions down to the most localized group which is appropriate to make it. We've had some idea of that traditionally in our law. We called it representation reinforcing. So it may well be that there are doctrines lurking around out there which, once the technology becomes sufficiently entrancing, may lead us to say different kinds of processes are due, or at least reasonable, or perhaps even someday unreasonable not to use for small groups, which wouldn't be the case yet, as far as I can tell. For big groups, more's the pity, perhaps. But anyway, that's my speculative question.
Great. Zephyr, Teachout.
Great. I'm not I guess I'm a lawyer, but I'm certainly not an administrative lawyer. And I've spent the past 2 years through November, my interaction with agencies was the interaction with the FEC. I had daily conversations, often 3 times a day, with lawyers when I was working both as Director of Online Organizing for Howard Dean and then at 2 different 527 organizations. The FEC is a daily experience for anybody involved in politics, especially involved in internet politics. My talk is a little bit off topic, but I want to sort of talk about 5 very poorly formed hunches that I have about this question of using the internet broadly for agency rulemaking. The first relates to Michael's last hypothesis, which is that I see the internet in my work primarily as an organizing tool, not as an information tool. And it is extraordinarily powerful at creating small deliberative groups. So I think that there is a real opportunity for offline meetings and events for agencies to use that as a source of information for rulemaking. The tool of email, one-way email, is extraordinarily crude. As you suggest, blogs are at least a step up from that commenting interactively, and so there's a lateral connection as well as a one-to-one connection would be very important. The second hunch is that comments are better for giving agency commissioners a sense of what we call stickiness, of what's actually happening, storytelling, rather than nose counting or voting. That if it's framed as, what do you think, and do you want to rant, people will rant and think a lot, and not necessarily give a very productive view of what the overall sort of American view is, but may, if you ask, tell me your stories about your experience with the Forest Service or your stories about the experience with the FEC, be extraordinarily productive at giving commissioners access to stories and this kind of stickiness that they might not otherwise have. The third hunch, which relates to what John was talking about, is that it all depends on the agency and the issue. That this is, as a citizen, I do not relate to agency rulemaking. I relate to the FEC or the Forest Service. I don't even think of agencies on a day-to-day basis as a big part of my life, although they clearly are. So that the answers for the rulemaking for one kind of agency may be very different. In law, we have bankruptcy courts that do things quite differently, and we think technocrats are better at bankruptcy. But in agencies, it may be the FEC. Yes, we do want a lot of interactive work on rulemaking, but we don't in other areas. The fourth hunch is that the visualization, which John started to do, is one of the most valuable things that these agencies can do, so that you get to see who is giving comments, where and when. And that will allow for some transparency, a really productive transparency about who is influencing, who may or may not be influencing agency decisions. And then the last is more sort of a hypothesis that relates to the stickiness question, which is that maybe a better analogy than voters is that we see people as witnesses, and think of citizens in speaking to agency members as we do think of witnesses in a trial, providing really, really concrete examples. And that sort of opens up a whole new way of thinking about what this what kind of interactions you might want, where you might want them, and how you might want them. Okay, that said, I want to talk a little bit about my personal experience with the FEC. As my work for the Dean campaign involved managing with basically one other person a couple 100,000 people who developed about 400 committee-structured local groups around the country that were, does that make sense? Sort of four or 500 groups that were grassroots, unpaid volunteers. My work with America Coming Together involved something similar, a different scale, developing completely unpaid, organized structures that were doing election work. The FEC was a real puzzle as a political actor, and so a couple of weeks ago I decided I was going to, instead of approaching the particular rules that drove me crazy, I was going to try to approach it as at a distance. I'd just seen the H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. I don't know if you've seen this. And in it he goes forward 600,000 years and walks into this beautiful field and sees this strange house, and he walks around the house and he sees that the chairs are a little low and he sees the fruit is really big, and by looking at the architecture of the house he can tell what kind of people live here. Like, you built this house in order for a particular vision of what the world is. And so I wanted to approach the FEC statutory structure as a stranger, as somebody sort of visiting from afar. Somebody building this structure, what kind of world do they see? What kind of assumptions do they make? The FEC was sort of came into being in the 70s as a response to all kinds of things. The world that they seem to have seen is a world with relatively few political actors, a world which has very clear lines between volunteering and donating, and a world where they were basically just trying to stop a lot of big money from directly influencing government. I want to talk very briefly, I know we don't have much time here, about the puzzle I'm sort of facing now with what I think the FEC, one of the puzzles the FEC is facing. There are several assumptions which are inherent, I think, in the FEC's very structure that have been undermined by the advent of the internet, and this is how it relates to sort of internet and agency law. The first is that there's a very clear, that agency, in the other sense of agency, is determinable. If I tell John to do something, it's clear that, and John is on my property, and John is paid by me, then I'll be guilty when John does something horrible. The internet in a lot of ways makes that very difficult. The question of who told what to do who. Listservs, websites, email interactions are not as clear as a lot of other kinds of, as sort of our historical sense of agency. Related to that is the idea that's at the core of a lot of what the FEC does, which is that coordination requires private conversation. So the big boogeyman for the FEC is super rich person wanting to help out candidate, and the FEC doesn't want super rich person to be able to spend millions of dollars helping out the candidate. So how do they stop it? Well, they want to stop collusion. They want to stop coordination. And historically, they've said, okay, well, you can't have coordinated activities. And the way we're going to make sure you can't is you can't have private conversations. Well, historically, that was okay, because if I'm a super rich person, I want to help out George Bush. I will buy a whole bunch of ads about terrorism. Well, I don't want to buy a whole bunch of ads about terrorism if I don't know that he's also giving a speech about terrorism the day before, and if I don't know my policy statements are consistent with his policy statements, and maybe he's actually saying something inconsistent. So unless I can have some private conversation with him, I'm just not going to do anything. I may, buy ads here or there, but I'm not going to have really effective strategic coordination. Now George Bush can put all 98% of his strategy up on the internet, and he does. You don't need private conversation in order to have really, really effective, influential coordination on the part of super rich people. So this idea of we can stop collusion, I think is really undermined by the internet. The second, and this comes even in the definitions of the FEC, is that there's a real clear difference between public communications and private voice. You can spend, it is not considered a campaign contribution to spend money on local volunteers, pamphlets, flyers, posters, working on a federal campaign. Is considered a contribution under the FEC to spend money on a local volunteer buying an ad in a local newspaper. The FEC has no idea what to do with spending money on a local volunteer having a website. No idea. And the various parties have taken great advantage of this. Okay, your micromedia sources are people who have 10,000 people on their email list. Is that somebody who's doing a public communication, or is that a private communication? A second core assumption, or fourth core assumption the FEC makes, is there's a clear line between volunteering and providing something of value. So the FEC is determined that you can't give money, okay, but there's all these people who are not going to give money, but they're going to give their services. I'm going to donate my lawyering services, although the FEC has dealt with that. I'm going to donate my capacity, my media strategy. I'm going to donate my software building services. Well, okay. We're basically, the FEC has broadly moved away from that. So, okay, that's something of value. You can't donate that because that's a way for you to get around the requirement that you not give so much money. You can't give $20,000 worth of software design services if you can't give $20,000 worth of money. Okay, but there is, according to the structure of the FEC, a complete freedom to volunteer. Because we can't stop people from volunteering. This is the core of our political voice, is the ability to go and use our personal skills to volunteer. The absurd results that happened in the 2004 election were that software developers decided they could volunteer, but not as software developers. Lawyers volunteered as software developers volunteered as media strategists. There was this sort of fascinating, everybody doing exactly what they don't know how to do, and it showed. Death penalty lawyers doing internet organizing. Anyway, so that's in the structure of the FEC. That's exploded. One more, which I think is going to be a big deal in the future, is that the FEC can stop foreign nationals from contributing to U.S. elections. In the past, it was thought of as foreign nationals here doing something locally. Well, we had a Chinese national who wanted to work on our open source software project. We kicked him off. We're conservative, but it creates this real puzzle. The Guardian asked its members to send letters to people in Iowa to encourage them to vote for Cary. This backfired, but the power is there. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Skype, but in the 2008 election, I will not be surprised if 30,000 people in China look up Chinese last names in Skype and call them and try to persuade them to vote a particular way. So it may be against the law according to the FEC, but there's really nothing they can do to stop that, or we'll see. There's a really sort of interesting jurisdictional questions that it hasn't dealt with. And finally, and this relates to this, is the idea that the statute is not, I think a core assumption of the way the statute is structured is that it's not going to be accessible to citizens. That people are not going to be reading the statute. It's not written in a friendly way. The site's nice. It has a nice little volunteer thing you can download if you sort of can find your way there. But I saw the direct effect of this, which was extraordinarily chilling. People were terrified of working for both the 527 and a Democratic organization. They read the FEC. It said, I can't provide services of value. There's a lot of chilling going on, and I think this sort of goes to this core question about the interaction between agencies and the public, is that the primary interaction, the one that we should be focused on, is not necessarily the commenting, but what the first interaction is when I go to the FEC, can I easily learn how to contribute? Can I easily learn how to be a political actor? And then maybe after we've gotten that engagement, then we can get into sort of higher levels of participation. But if it's already so difficult on the first step, we're not even going to get there.
Great. I'm going to use the moderator's privilege before opening it to questions to make a few comments and then throw a question to everybody here. I think that my own sense is that one of the great things about having lots and lots of comments come in is that it will help us run an experiment, which is where do agency decisions get made? If we think that the notice and comment process is in fact where the substantive decisions get made, then maybe additional comments might make a difference. There are some who think the notice and comment process is kabuki theater, that the decisions have been made outside of that, in which case enabling people to make additional comments is just a great head fake, right? We're giving them the illusion of participation, and in fact they're participating in something that is irrelevant to a policy process. So that I'm going to put this as a question, but before I do, let me just tell you my own guess about what changes in the ability of people to make comments will actually produce. My guess is that contra what John was suggesting, maybe Cary, my guess is that increased quantity will make fairly little difference. And I think that it's just there being more comments. And I think that's because agency heads are likely to conclude, rightly or wrongly, well, this is just probably AstroTurf. This is just probably a bunch of people who were sending stuff in. And that's the case even though in the media ownership context, Commissioner Copps in dissent claimed that over 99% of the comments, and by the way, a total of over 1 million comments, that over 99% were opposed to the media ownership rules. So if you're looking at quantity, you got a vote of 99-1 with 1 million comments. And you know what? The vote was going to be 3-2 no matter what. With 1 comment or with 1 million comments, we had, I don't see any substantive change in those results. Now that doesn't mean necessarily that quality doesn't make a difference. I can imagine ways we might think that the internet might enable better quality comments. I was talking to Michael earlier about the possibilities and the perils of wikis, but you could imagine a comment via wiki. That is, somebody puts up a comment, someone else can add to it. Now, this depends on whether your vision is, at the end, would it be a nice, clearly argued comment, or would it be a bunch of gibberish with like stuff about Falun Gong in it? Or, you can make your own guesses as to what would be the outcome there. But we might imagine that this would produce better quality. Do I think that affects agency heads? No, I actually don't think. I'm one of those people who thinks the agency heads are not being very heavily influenced by the comment process. That's just a guess, but that is my guess. But it does affect 2 things. One, I think that's going to affect the staffers more directly, those who have to respond to the comments. Having more comments to respond to doesn't do anything if there are more comments that say the same. Having an additional comment that makes a different point, if nothing else, forces you to write a little more in justification of the rule and may at the margin have some impact. Still, that's a pretty marginal impact. Where do I think the impact is really going to be? Now, John, now I get to put on my lawyer's hat. I'm not an economist. I don't play one on TV, but I am a lawyer, is in judicial review. So courts require that agencies take a hard look at all significant comments that are made. If courts are interested in engaging in some serious scrutiny, the more comments there are, the more they can find something in there the agency didn't respond to. The famous line about legislative history was that it's like going to a party and looking for your friends. Well, that's even more true when you're talking about looking at all the comments that are made. You can find some comment and say, I, the judge, think this was significant, and you, the agency, didn't respond to it. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that depends on your vision of what courts do. It probably will slow down the regulatory process to some degree, make it harder to enact regulations. But if you think judicial review does some good, then more power to us. If you think judges are just sticking their noses in a way that's harmful, then this is lousy. But with all of that lead-in, the real question that I want to give you all a chance to respond to each other, but I also, one obvious question that comes to mind is, especially for, I guess, Cary and John, what good do we imagine, or is there any good, let me put it this way, is there any good to enabling people to comment more if we think it actually isn't affecting the outcome? Let me just briefly note, I could imagine people saying, well, I feel like I get to participate, but I could also imagine other people saying, but if I really know it's irrelevant, I wouldn't want to waste my time. So I'm just wondering, especially on your 2 hypotheses, yes, it can be more efficient, but in terms of people's involvement, what good are we going to get from enhanced involvement? Anybody can answer this, but let me start with Cary and John, and then.
Thanks for those provocative questions. I think first to the point of whether agencies actually take comments into account. There's actually a very recent and good political science study by Bill West. He looked at 42 rules and found that only of the 42, only about 28 involved significant conflict. Okay, that most rules just are pretty innocuous things. Okay, and they don't involve. So 28 involved significant conflict. Of those, he found that only 16, roughly half, actually were changed in any way from the proposed rule to the final rule. And of those 16 that were changed, only 5 were changed because of something in the comments. And only 1 was changed because there was some new information actually conveyed in the comments. So I think that there's good evidence that comments don't make a whole lot of difference. The real action comes in drafting the proposed rule. That's when the agency's scurrying around and collecting information, but it's not collecting it through comments. It's through ex parte communications, principally, and through good investigative work and analysis. So with that said, what does come from the public comment? And is there anything, as you say, that good can come from an increased quantity, especially if it's not going to make that much difference in the decision making? I guess I would depart from what I heard John to be saying a bit about the value of email and comments as providing a signal to the agency about, wow, this is a rule that really gets the public animated. I think that signaling value comes from the relative numbers of comments much more than the absolute numbers. And if in the world without e-commenting, have a rule that elicits 600 comments from ordinary letters, I know that that's much more important because most of my rules only are generating 50 comments, right? The fact that we now can have, 1 million comments, well, I don't know that really qualitatively gives you much more signaling value. I also don't think that tells you anything really about the underlying preference structures. And here I would depart, I guess, from John's bell curve. It would tell you something if these were random. This was a random sample, and 1 million people randomly sampled should tell you more than 3 people randomly sampled, right? But this is not a randomly sampled. We don't know the underlying shape of the preferences of society with respect to the rule. That's what you're trying to figure out. And what you have to try to figure that out are the comments that people voluntarily submit. We know in so many studies that volunteers are different than other people. They care more, perhaps, they are more educated, they have a higher economic status usually. They're not like everybody else. So the question is, if you're getting more comments, to go back to John's bell curve, are you getting more people just from the extreme, or are you actually moving, so if you think of that bell curve as representing everybody in society, you might have previously had 1,000 people from the extreme commenting. Now you have 1 million people, but they're still from the extreme. We don't know if they've really moved. And why don't we know? In part because these comments that are coming in, and I think John's data are wonderful to see this, by and large, don't give you a whole lot of information about people's preferences. A one-line comment that says, this rule, don't adopt the media ownership rule, or other things that are probably can't be said in polite company. I mean, these are actually the kinds of comments that are coming in. They don't really give you enough to gauge, well, is this a moderate opposition to the media ownership rule, or is this a fervent opposition? So it's going to be very hard, I think. Even though intuitively, if this were a random sample, it might make sense that more is better. Here, I don't think that more is going to tell you more. And that's why, unless we can go to something where there's random sampling, contingent valuation studies, or some such, or representative samples of juries, that just allowing volunteers in larger quantities to submit comments, it may lead us to make judgments about the underlying preference structure that are just plain wrong, rather than actually helping us find the truth.
I want to speak to that briefly because we actually had an experience with 600,000. We had 600,000 or so people on the Dean email list, and we had various ways of learning information. We had a blog, we had email feedback, we had forums, and I went and visited about 60 grassroots groups. And we did a survey. The blog, the email, and the forums are horrible ways to measure overall preference, or at least for that group of 600,000. They do provide very valuable information, however. It's just not information about strength of preference or the character of the people.
What does it provide you information on?
There's extraordinary, two things. One is there's information and there's an organizing value. One is that extraordinary inventiveness. And I don't know that much about administrative rulemaking, but it's always valuable to have new ideas. I actually think 2% of the rules that you talked about in West Studies, that's high. I'm amazed. And up to 20% if you include the 5. So anyway, I think there's an inventive value, and then there's also the value of sort of creating lateral connections and more understanding of what's going on. And I do I want to insist on this. The relationship is more than commenting. It's a relationship of understanding what the laws are in our country, which is a very valuable thing.
John?
Yeah.
Oh, you have a wireless. You don't even have to lean forward.
Well, I actually took off the wireless. So I think your question and Cary's reply suggests that there's two aspects to your question. The first is, do we want democratic rulemaking or deliberative rulemaking? And then, so the first is a normative question, should we? And the second question is, do we? I think those are very different questions because we start off with perhaps we don't care about these people at all, and maybe we should just have interest groups on opposite sides providing good quality information, high technical substance, high political substance, and providing this information and engaging in deliberative rulemaking. This was in essence the State Farm case, and maybe that's what we want. And if that's the case, from a normative standpoint, we don't really care that much about what individuals think, and this stuff about individual participation in the democratic process is probably not. In the rulemaking process is perhaps not extraordinarily valuable. So I think that there's kind of a meta question, which is, do we want this involved or not? So let's assume for a moment that we do. I'm not saying we do, but I'm saying suppose we do. Then how do we encourage that? If we want that, it seems to me that that you do want to lower the cost to engage in some kind of to engage in this comment and to engage in comment procedures. The data I showed is not just comment and replies. It includes the all ex partes, which are these one-shot emails that come after the comment and reply period. And so it includes everything as a comment in that data set. And it seems to me that if you do decrease the cost, you are going to encourage on the margin additional people to participate who wouldn't otherwise participate. In this cell phone example that I provided, the people at the FCC actually say because we have this online commenting system, we're getting a lot of people commenting who would not otherwise comment because it's just not cost effective for them to sit down and write a letter to the commission. So I think Cary's right about, it's all about relativeness, but I do also think that when you lower the cost, if you get the cost really low, you actually will expand the base of people, the preferences, that you will get people who wouldn't otherwise write a letter, but now actually will participate. So I think that actually does happen. I don't think we just continue to draw from the extreme distribution. I think we may draw more from the extreme distribution, but we do move down the distribution. I think Cary's right is how far down the distribution do we move? Maybe we only move slightly, but that's a question I can't answer. But at least I think we do move down the distribution. We get a more representative sample. Let me go to the second part is what's really happening? Do these democratic procedures actually induce changes in behavior of regulators? My sense, and I've been studying the FCC now for 7 years, 8 years, and I've talked to pretty much everyone there. And my sense is that that the notice of proposed rulemaking, if you talk to any lobbyist, they say if you try to come in at the comment and reply time, you're too late. You have to be at the time when they're actually constructing the proposed rule at the notice of proposed rulemaking. And at that time, there's not a lot of public comment. There's not a lot of democratic participation. It's an inside job. And in fact, you don't see these disclosed in the data because they're technically not ex partes because it's not been docketed. So there's a lot of inside ball game happening here. So that's the first, so I think that's exactly right. The second thing is I think even in the comment and replies, if you talk to the people at the FCC, what do you do with these? They say, we just write down 13,000 miscellaneous comments. That's how it appears in the ex parte disclosures, right? They don't even, on docket number, 02 was 117. And they don't actually even say, they don't itemize them at that point. They only itemize the interest groups. They don't itemize the emails. And these, there's 13,000 pages that get printed and get stuck somewhere and they're gone, right? And they're basically, and it seems to me that there's not a lot of attention paid to actually the substance of these emails, though someone must be going and tallying up against or with us or against us on these issues. I think that in reality, these democratic processes can make a difference, but they don't make a difference. That's, I think, that's why I'm trying to make this normative versus positive thing. I think actually they make, except in the most extreme cases, like the Janet Jackson case, I think that these things make almost no difference. That we get these comments, we just bin them, we stick them in some storage facility, they don't really say much, and we just leave them. That doesn't mean that occasionally when the public is truly outraged, as in the Janet Jackson, that someone says, wow, we should pay attention to this and we should levy a pretty hefty fine and maybe change the rules. And I think some of it was about what Zephyr said, which is about congressional action. What are we trying to induce? It was Michael. Are we trying to induce congressional action or are we trying to induce regulatory action? So I think that only in extreme cases, so from a positive sense, my sense is that these comments only make a difference in extreme action, but could they make a difference? I think that they could and should make a slightly larger difference than they do now.
Michael, is there anything?
I had a question for other people.
Sure. Although I want to open it. You had a question, then I want to open it up. Okay.
I'm not sure exactly who I should direct this at. So, but there was a mention, I think, in Cary's talk about how cost-benefit analysis is a sort of a direction to agencies to weigh preferences. And of course, that's true. But it's true in a very special way because it's sort of dollar-weighted preference. It's a preference intensity. It's not counting noses, right? The noses aren't all the same in cost-benefit analysis. It depends how much skin you have in the game. So you might count a lot more than me, if you're a regular user of the scenery, or you have a factory and I don't, or and so I guess I'm wondering, just what the cost-benefit lesson teaches us, if anything, about the noses. Because my knee-jerk reaction is not much, and I got the feeling your answer was something substantial. I may have misunderstood.
Well, I think the problem about noses is we all have one, and we all have only one, right? And yet our preferences are not binary. I mean, voting is a poor way of aggregating preferences, if that's what it's designed to do, because everybody votes yes or no. Now, if we each had 100 votes, and we could allocate them in different ways, and of course there are electoral voting systems that allow you to do those sorts of things, those are better aggregators of people's preferences because they take into account the intensity, right? And so I think analytic tools that try to capture those intensities and try to capture them for not just a few people in society who happen to know about or care enough about to send in a comment, but to try to get those intensities for everyone is clearly head and shoulders above relying on what comes in through the public comment process as a strategy for if indeed, and I agree with John, I think there's a prior question here. Do we want regulatory agencies to be viewing their job just as aggregating preferences? But I think there's a reasonably strong argument that they should, yes. But they should only be doing it for everyone and taking everyone should be counted equally, but the fact that some people care more than others ought to enter into the equation in a way that comments don't really allow you to do, at least when they're a one-liner kind of comment.
All right, questions from the audience. Sure, Ian. Oh, that's right. Well, just talk loudly enough. The mics will pick you up, I think.
Oh, okay. You brought up a point earlier regarding State Farm and the notion of moving away from a model where courts are constantly checking the move forward. I think that there's a danger to that, in the sense that we live in a nation now where if turnout had been slightly higher in Columbus and slightly lower in Clark County, we'd have a very different government, and it would reflect about 50% of the nation in the same way that the government we have now reflects about 50% of the nation. And the check that the courts have is that the courts pick up the zeitgeist of the nation over the course of 30 years. So it maintains a residue of past presidents, and that means that if the current president doesn't speak to the whole nation, then there's a chance for that residue to compensate and provide more of a national voice. Agencies don't have that advantage for the most part. Many agencies, the president comes in, he gets the opportunity to clean house, and he gets the opportunity to put in his partisans who will enact the policies of 50%. And so I worry about taking that check the courts provide and preventing a president from pushing a view which is very opposed to a large swath of the nation. So I wonder how you would rectify that tension, and how you think the internet would allow that tension, could pick up the tension that the courts currently pick up.
Well, I think probably to the extent that you're relying on, well, I'm not sure how the internet would, I'm not sure about the last point here, how the internet would sort of affect, or is it the same kind of question that Stuart's mentioning about how the internet would affect the extent to which courts should defer to agencies' decisions if they're based upon a large number of comments? That seems to be one question. Is that your question?
Well, I guess my question is that, looking at the internet or looking at any other means, if you take the courts out of the picture, what do you put back in so that you still have that check on the executive branch?
Okay, so the State Farm decision, the court said, we're not going to allow just a change of administrations to be a sufficient reason all by itself for you to make a regulatory decision, to enact a rule or rescind a rule. What you have to do is you have to provide a reasoned basis for your decision. And I think it's probably easy to overstate what that requirement does. In practice, I think a Republican administration that comes in and wants to do away with something that a Democratic administration has put in place can come up with a reason for it, can defend it. In fact, the Reagan administration under Liddy Dole came up with a new passive restraint rule in a couple of years' time, which went from an 11-page preamble in the Federal Register, the one that State Farm reviewed, to about a 50-page preamble, and they were able to sustain the burden that the court gave. What I think the court does, and what I think doctrine does, is it says it signals something about the purpose of regulatory decision-making. That's really important. That it says that public servants ought to be motivated by serving the entire country, and ought to be able to defend that in a reasoned way, rather than just being able to say we are enacting the whims of the new Democratic majority in Washington. And that's, I think, an important message for public servants who, even though these agencies are headed by officials that are appointed by an elected official, by and large, most of the work is going on by people who are not elected. And I think it's a wonderful thing for the courts, even symbolically, to say, remember, what you're there for is to serve everybody.
Ryan and then Jonathan.
When talking about this in the context of agencies and promulgating rules, going to CFR or what have you, I'd like to recast it into a slightly different context and see if this affects any of the comments that you all have made. And that's, excuse me, comments made against an environmental impact statement. I think the context shift there is sufficient, or is important in ways that implicate judicial review and also the legitimacy concerns that Professor Froomkin brought up. And I wonder if you're talking about a smaller impact area and a group of people affected than a national rule that's being promulgated. I'm wondering if comments as associated with an EIS, if a difference in context gives rise to a difference in the analysis that y'all have gone to.
No, I don't think so. I mean, unless to the extent that you think that, in a particular context, you will generate better information from the. I mean, I think there's to the extent that comments can bring in better or more information to inform regulators' decisions. So if you had let's say an agency deciding to regulate the metal finishing industry, and there's, I don't know, maybe 3,000 metal finishing shops in the country, and you get responses from 10 of those shops saying they're opposed to the rule. And then compare that with, say, under electronic commenting, you get 1,000 metal finishing shops commenting that they're opposed to the rule. I think that gives you some information value about how this rule will be implemented and the degree to which a significant portion of the industry would probably be inclined to resist implementing it as fully as the government was. A similar sort of thing came with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the passive restraints. There was a real concern. It wasn't done through electronic commenting, but there was a concern that the public was going to disable these automatic seatbelts. To the extent that you get information that a large number of the regulated target is likely to resist whatever command you're going to place upon them, I think that can have significant informational value for the agency in saying, well, maybe we shouldn't estimate the benefits to be from this rule to be what we're estimating. We shouldn't assume full compliance if a third of the industry is telling us they're opposed to the rule, or if a significant portion of the public tells us they don't want seatbelts that are automatic. So sometimes you can get information value, and I'm not saying you won't. There's no context in which you will. So there may be context where you get that better.
Very quickly, I want to go even farther than you. I actually think there's no information value in numbers so far. I mean, I think there's huge capacity for increasing and a huge opportunity for more interaction. But I've been involved in too many of the cynical campaigns that Michael talks about. Petitions and these kinds of things are the sort of lifeblood of organizations. I'd be really curious to know, John, in your chart, in your 4x4, 2x2, whether you said there isn't a big impact on sort of public interest organizations. Well, how many of the big impact of the individuals is public interest organizations asking those individuals to do something? So far, I see zero value in numbers.
Well, I guess I'm not ready to go there yet, that I see zero value in numbers. Partly because it depends on the scale. If 3/4 of people in a small town think something, I think that's important. And partly because I guess I'm still, a small D Democrat, and it haven't worked out to my own satisfaction why it's okay to make national decisions about who writes the statutes by counting noses, and it's inevitably wrong. We have, especially everything we know which has debunked the culture of the cult of the expert. Nothing really great has replaced that cult yet, so maybe we should go back to the original cult. Two other thoughts that are not directly responsive to what you say, but are just sort of in this area. One is that as we get away from rulemaking, the other thing that agencies do, we have to start the calculations all over again. That doesn't mean they necessarily lead somewhere else. It means I just haven't done them. The thing about the agencies that work primarily on enforcement, to what extent should the enforcement priorities of the agencies be driven by public outcry? We can tell terrible stories about that. We can tell great stories about that. I just think it's a question people need to think about much more organized than I have. And not all rulemakings are alike. There's a special class of rulemaking, which are the ones where they do multiple NPRMs, because the second draft is a bolt from the blue or a swerve or whatever fancy DC Circuit phrase we're using this week. And those are special. And I would be, it might be that those are the ones where comments actually matter. And even if all this stuff is in reserve just for those special, difficult, complex, trouble cases, that might not be so terrible.
I just wanted to say just one word about this. There's an interesting phenomenon going on where, as you lower the cost for participation, I was thinking of your metal finishing example, what you do is you begin to disaggregate the trade associations. And the interest groups, in essence, become disaggregated because we no longer need the trade association to aggregate our preferences and to state our preferences as one unified organization. Instead, if there are clearly identifiable groups within the trade association that can participate, what you do is you disaggregate the experts, and you might actually begin to disaggregate the expertise that the trade associations provide and supplemental expertise to the firms themselves. And I think this is an issue that is important because in things such as, and I've worked on, I've actually had 1 or 2 papers on one particular issue of the FCC, lobbying over payphone compensation issues, in which when you make a 1-800 call, you don't pay for the 1-800 call to payphone, but it turns out that the long distance company pays the payphone owner 35 cents or whatever the fee is. And there was a big fight over this. There's lots and lots and lots of little payphone owners, and they aggregated through the trade association. But they didn't, if you look at the ex partes, they did not go directly to the FCC, and they allowed the trade association to aggregate their cost structures and to transmit that to the FCC to say the fees you're charging are way too low. We need much, much more if we're going to stay in business. The FCC seemed to treat this as just one data point instead of 3,000 data points that underlie the data. And in essence, the payphone business is basically almost eliminated today because the fees are in essence too low. And people use their cell phones when they make a call, but many times to not use minutes, they'll go to the payphone and make the 1-800 call because it's free and they don't use their minutes. So you see these kinds of things happening. And there's an important factor that I think gets lost in the discussion about aggregation and disaggregation of preferences and expertise when you lower the cost too low to provide information.
Jonathan and then Chris.
Two thoughts. One is comment on the earlier question about the endurance of attitudes in regulatory agencies. My thought there was that regulatory agencies do not change so quickly, and I think as Cary mentioned briefly, that they have persistent cultures that in addition to the vast majority of staff being career, not political appointees, even political appointees often rapidly adopt the culture of the agency, and it's common for new administrations to be shocked at the rate at which their teammates from the campaign, once appointed to be a cabinet secretary, suddenly are defending the agency against the White House. In the first year of the first Clinton administration, the cabinet secretaries were appointed before many of the White House staff were appointed. And even though those cabinet secretaries had been close advisors to Bill Clinton on the campaign, there was immediately power went to the cabinet agencies, and the White House was scrambling to catch up. Also in the administration preceding that, I can remember a White House official, whom I won't name, I guess, who saying that the Secretary of Transportation, I believe, was the fastest case of capture by his agency in history. That was Andy Card. So these things are not. It's not the case that that presidents control the agencies so tightly. Presidents have been struggling to control agencies, and that's controversial. I'm not saying that they should control them so tightly, but that's. Now, what does that have to do with the internet? I think was Cary's question. I'm not sure how the internet changes that. I want to ask this question, following on Stuart's point. What do the panelists think are the future scenarios for the way that courts will and agencies will handle the overwhelming flow of internet-based comments? For example, one possible scenario might be that the courts will say, agencies are incapable of handling 1 million. You thought 1 million comments was large? Wait till there are 10 million comments or 100 million comments. Agencies are incapable of handling that, so we have to relax the hard look doctrine. We have to basically not require agencies to respond to all these comments. An alternative scenario might be that the courts are still tough on the agencies, and the agencies have to devote much more time to handling all these comments, or develop much more sophisticated methods of digesting them in the future. And maybe that will further ossify the administrative state, or maybe the agencies will actually start learning a lot from these comments if they become more sophisticated in handling them. So I wonder what your thoughts are on those future scenarios.
I think there's another option there, which is that the agencies can learn how to pre-digest, in the sense, the comments, to have commenting structures which aren't just the flat drop in a comment we have now, so that if they are taking part in some sort of structured conversation or structured system or even self-identifying system, the agencies aren't going to be as overwhelmed as they might otherwise be. I mean, that doesn't mean it won't take more resources than they'd have somebody go through and parse this stuff. It might, but certainly current doctrine would allow the court to say it's impossible, only if the agency made a pretty strong showing the resources just absolutely weren't there.
What I think is likely is probably what's happened online in general, is reputation systems that for comments, you need maybe 10,000 people signing on to a particular comment before the agency has to really pay attention to it, and the rest of it, it can sort of ignore. I think there's a lot more exciting possibilities, but that kind of thing I think is more likely and not that hard.
And not consistent with the APA.
I've actually not seen a review of the FCC that has ever kind of said you didn't address comments that came through these systems. So at least to date, it doesn't seem that that's an issue. Though if it becomes an issue, you can be sure that interest groups will begin to game the system in ways which I think are quite strategic. For example, if what they might start doing is putting little pieces of their arguments throughout these little comments, and then on the whole they make a big argument, and there's no way the FCC can address that in the span of 80,000 comments coming from minimum wage workers in China. And so I think what you're going to see is you can see if the court allows adheres to our very hard, strong hard look doctrine, what you're going to get exploitation by the interest groups for remands of the decisions back to the agencies, because they did not address, according to APA standards, the comments that were necessary. And I've done some work on this in some other venues, and you see that you get this. You see strategic behavior on the part of interest groups in providing even written comments to the agency based on their expectation that the agency won't be able to respond, and they'll get it remanded back to the agency and have a second chance.
Which isn't really the end of the world, getting a remand. But I think John's data here suggests that this isn't really a big issue, except for the exceptional rule. The trend you were showing is fairly flat, and I suspect that it will stay flat for most rules, but there will be the occasional one, and I suspect that what agencies will do with those is to adopt the same kind of technology tools that are now allowing people to submit these comments. They're going to have text summarization and other kinds of language processing devices. In fact, there's a consulting firm right now, ICF, that is marketing its services for agencies when they have rules that generate a large number of comments. So you will see the market and technology coming along that will help agencies for these, once in a lifetime kinds of rules where there's a million comments, and technology will help in identifying and categorizing the comments. And I don't think so. I'm not of the mind that this will ossify rulemaking a whole lot.
Just quick. Oh, sorry.
I'm just going to say one of the simplest things agencies could do is allow people to comment more directly on specific sections of a rule, rather than just having to put in comments at the end of the whole thing, and that would sort of pre-sort in a way that would help everybody understand what's going on.
Jonathan, was something you wanted?
Just one follow-up is another possible scenario is that to get what I think Zephyr Teachout was calling inventiveness, new ideas, interesting ideas that wouldn't necessarily have 10,000 people sign on, maybe just one person out of the 10 million comments, is software that analyzes all the comments and finds ideas that haven't been mentioned elsewhere. That seems, maybe that's what Cary.
That's right. That's exactly the kind of technology.
Talking about are going to develop.
Right,
are gonna do.
right. And there's actually, I mean, the e-rulemaking initiative at the federal level has put in some funding. The NSF right now is developing some funding through their digital government research program on some research that will take text summarization and categorization software tools and apply them to rulemakings, allow sorting of this kind to identify the commonalities across comments.
The only thing I was going to add before getting to Chris is just on this point about it's always possible courts will reduce the review. My argument would be this is giving them a new arrow in the quiver if they choose to use it to do more. And the other thing that I would at least add for people to think about is remember that the people who are reading these rules are not the agency heads. So when they're hearing this idea of like, oh great, there's some new form of software that's going to identify, they're thinking like, great, I get to spend like that many more weeks just poring over the things that the software has identified, and I know darn well it's not going to ever filter up anyway. And this does go back to my original question, sort of what difference does it make? But Chris.
Of whether you want a deliberative system or a democratic system, there's another alternative, which is whatever system you think is dominant in that realm ought to try to endogenize the other. So if you're in a deliberative system, you take Cary's case, two options, both are legal, both are constitutional. Should what public preferences are matter in that situation? Yeah, I think it should count as a reason. So you endogenize public opinion into your deliberative process. In a democratic system, I'd rather be ruled by a bunch of people where they go in the ballot box, have thought about other people's preferences a little bit, and asked whether that ought to reflect my view, that ought to cause me to adjust my thinking on this issue before I vote my purely private preferences. And I think that a lot of democratic deliberative theory tries to build systems that cause people to reflect upon public issues, like Fishkin's experiments with deliberative polling and other kinds of strategies. So that's a non-dichotomized model that gives you some relevance for vote counting even in a deliberative system, but it shouldn't be just vote counting. It shouldn't be, I got to figure out where 50 plus 1% of the public are, and then that's my reason. Could it be a factor? Sure. Do the internet systems do a very good job in surfacing that? I don't think so. I agree with everything that's been said about that so far. But the agency, of course, has other ways of taking that into account, and we all know they do. It's not just what the president wants, it's what Congress wants, and what Congress wants is often what constituents want. And so the fact that it's relevant, and yet you look at comments and don't see much change, doesn't yet indicate that the public's will isn't being expressed in the process at some prior step. I mean, if you took a kind of thought experiment, a sort of perfectly responsive deliberative system, comments would never matter.
Right.
Because the parties would have figured out ahead of time what the relevant role they ought to play was. And then when the information came in about what comments were, the agency would say, oh yeah, I knew that. I'd taken that into account. Let's go ahead with what we wanted. Now, on the positive point of whether or not they make a difference, and I'm interested in what people think the standard for making a difference ought to be, because we've got a lot of processes in the law that don't make differences very often. Most justices will tell you oral argument doesn't make a difference because the case has been brief and they're lower court opinions and justices have prepared and they've figured out what they want. It's not like the British system where you used to have arguments for several days and the judges didn't know the facts. But do we think that's kabuki theater? Well, maybe. Most criminal trials don't occur because the defense attorney knows if that trial is going to make a difference, it's going to make things worse for my client. So I'm going to plea bargain out 95% of the cases. And in the other handfuls of cases, procedures inside the trial don't make much of a difference because the evidence is overwhelming one way or the other. So the evidence I heard was that comments make a difference. In some, it's a small percentage of the cases, but it's not zero. And even if it were the odd case, as John says, well, so what's the standard? It just seems to me that the comment procedure as a process is being looked at through a very peculiar lens that we don't use to look at lots of other processes that we think are fairly important to decision making. So the last thing is, even if you didn't think that internet access was a useful tool on this vote counting dimension, there are lots of other advantages of it. Like it makes deliberative kind of inputs a lot easier for people who can't hire Washington attorneys, for people who are dealing with Ryan's kind of situation of an EIS change and they're in Des Moines or they're out in Montana. And the fact that there's a docket there that they can use is the difference between whether they're going to be able to be one of those inventive people or not. Every so often I submit comments on behalf of organizations. I'd never do any of that stuff if I had to go to Washington and spend a couple of days sifting through dockets and getting data and information, and then had to worry about filing the thing, through the mails at times when anthrax is, leads you to be insecure about whether it's going to get there or not. So the internet access can mean a lot for that kind of deliberative but localized decision making and groups. But then, of course, once you have this system of easy access, lots of people can shove these one-line emails into the system or through the internet expert or whatever. The fact that that's happening and creating a lot of noise in the system, software, I think, is a great approach to that kind of problem. But it doesn't suggest to me that it suggests to me you shouldn't ignore the positive benefits that are being achieved by lowering the transaction costs of this enterprise, just because you think that the big numbers that you're getting in some cases ought not to make much of a difference.
I'd like to just say just a couple things about that. The first is that one thing that the FCC does is that they make you might remember I showed two graphs. One is the number of filings, and the second was the number of pages. They actually make a big difference as to how long the filing is. A lot of these one-page filings they just get rid of, and it's the more substantive filings that they pay a lot more attention to. And so they are thinking about ways of sorting through these comments and trying to figure out that this actually might have some substance, and the other one, and these 15,000 don't. I just wanted to say that. I think also from a social science perspective, one of the challenges is to determine whether how you figure out comments matter. Do comments matter or not matter? One way that I've tried to deal with this in a paper is to look at what the original NPRM said. And obviously, oftentimes the original proposed rule will have a range of outcomes. And if you see an outcome that's actually that the FCC chooses at the final rule to be different outside of the bounds that they articulated in the NPRM, it suggests that the comments mattered. Something happened that made them choose something outside of the bounds, and that comments mattered. And so that's one way. But from a social science perspective, it's really hard to know precisely how much comments matter. It's just really, really hard to know. And if anyone has ideas, it would be great from my perspective.
I want to second what you said, Chris. We'll back off a little bit on the zero number story. But largely, part of the reason I want to tell the zero number story is to focus on the other values, which I think are extraordinary, and the value of the person who can't otherwise access this process or complain otherwise is extraordinary, the impotence that they feel without the internet. And this possibility of having an impact. Also, the Janet Jackson story is a story of an organized campaign. If people knew about the FEC commenting process, you'd see really unusual Janet Jackson moments. You'd see moments that are not orchestrated, not organized, but that are actually more of a cultural or societal response to things. And that's valuable in its own way. So I actually think we should be really pushing for these values and then working on what Michael's talking about the really difficult structural questions of how to design this.
I just want to agree with what I think I heard you say and make sure I heard it right. There's the second part of what you said really, as I heard it, describe comments as a kind of a safety valve to see if the agency missed something really important, and judicial review polices that to make sure that the agency is listening at least for new things it hadn't thought about in the beginning. And of course, that's a story which resonates deeply with our traditional doctrine, and indeed with the fact that the agencies tend to be upheld when they go to the circuits. And again, we tell a story about how it's that they know that they're being watched is as important perhaps as the fact that they're being overturned and keeps them to a certain straight and narrow. So that's a very resonant, nice, elegant story which I think we left out here. So I think if that's what you meant, thank you.
I thank you too. I think those are terrific comments in which I agree with the thrust of them. And I think your analogy to oral argument at the courts is an apt one for a number of reasons. One, it leads me to just draw an analogy about what I'm trying to say here about public comments. If you were to apply it into the court context, if you had the Supreme Court say, well, we're deciding for the respondents here because they had 50 friends of, amicus briefs filed on their behalf and there were only 2 on the other, that would seem to me to be against all of our notions of what the rule of law is supposed to be about. It's similarly, I think, against our notions about what public interested decision-making by agencies ought to be if an agency were to give as a reason for its decision that they got, 99% of a million comments coming in on one side or another. So that would be the kind of analogy about the point that I'm trying to make. And I would agree with you entirely that process, Michael used the word safety valve, I might use the word option value. So we might want to have an oral argument from the court, even though it doesn't matter most of the time, because it gives us we get an option to get some information sometimes from it. Now that means we want to have an hour for oral argument and not a whole day, probably for most rules. But similarly, we want to have a comment process that's available and accessible there. And as I said in my closing comments, closing to my opening remarks, I think there are some reasons to have electronic rulemaking, and one is if you get more comments, you're going to increase, I think, the probability that you will get at least one comment that's useful, and that means you should be open to that. That gives a reason for having an electronic commenting as an option. It does mean that, we should not spend years holding the comment period open to try to get one good comment. But if we can make it to the state of the art with our communications technologies that we have and people are using in their ordinary lives, yes, let's do it. It's not that costly, and we'll deal with the large number of rules through some software or the like when those rules come in. Just to add briefly to what others have said, Chris, I think your points are very fair ones, and it may be that in part, let me speak for myself, my own comments are in reaction to what I imagine might be a notion of, oh, this will make a huge difference, and my suggestion is I think it won't make that much of a difference. But I acknowledge that in my comments, I'm applying sort of a cost-benefit threshold that we frankly don't apply in other contexts. Let me say, I've long been convinced that the reason we have oral arguments is because the Supreme Court bar likes to have oral arguments and the justices like the show of it, and that it would be much more efficient, in fact, for the justices simply to be able to email questions to lawyers when they had questions on the briefs, or maybe in some situation some number of them could decide they would sit around a table, the lawyers could come in, they could ask a few questions, and they could come and go as they wanted to ask their questions. There's no question in my mind that'd be more efficient. And we have oral argument because it's all about the show, but that it's not, in fact, doesn't make sense on a cost-benefit analysis. That is the lens that I'm applying here when I'm talking about the comments. I do think having oral argument in every case has a little bit of a marginal benefit. Is it worth all the costs involved? Probably not. I'm applying the same kind of lens when I'm talking about adding in all the internet comments, and there I think the costs are even lower, but I just want to acknowledge that you're right, that I am not talking about the existence of any benefit. I'm acknowledging that, but I'm sort of wondering, is it worth the candle?
Can I just say there is a limit on the value of the oral argument analogy, as I understand it, at least from Supreme Court practitioners, and that is that the justices use that as a way to communicate among themselves, so that or so the story goes, and that isn't something that would be the same in the comments. Now, if we could switch to a more interactive model where the agency staff were interacting with commenters in some real-time or rolling fashion, that might be quite interesting.
Well, and it occurs. That's what we call ex parte communications.
But it would be, if we could policy to make that more transparent.
Yeah. And for you all who don't know, in fact, it is illegal for a majority of a multi-member commission or agency to get together and without having to be a notice meeting called in advance. This is the Sunshine Act. So in fact, if two FCC members are walking down the hallway discussing some order, and a third walks up to them, they have to talk about sports or weather. They cannot talk about agency business. But that's neither. I saw a hand. Yes.
I want to go back to this kind of numbers or useless argument. And I'm curious, because I'm looking at a government website at the moment that indicates that as of October 2003, less than 60% of the entire U.S. population had access to the internet. So the question is, although the internet may reduce the marginal cost of making a comment, is it meaningful in the sense that we're expanding the number of people overall that have access to?
Is that access or home access?
This is internet use from any location by individuals 3 and older. And there's another one with broadband and so forth. You know, are we just making it cheaper for people like ourselves to access the government, or are we really giving, the real grassroots of people in Iowa or wherever the chance to?
I really wonder about that number, because at least where I live in Miami-Dade, it's 100%, because every library has got a whole bunch of internet terminals, and you go in, you sign up, you don't have to give your name, you only get it for about an hour ago. But that means anybody who can find their way to the library and is sufficiently literate to type has access.
But it is true that wealthy people tend to have easier access and
Right.
use it
Oh, yes.
more. I mean, there is a skew. There's no question.
Oh, yes.
And I think, but it goes much deeper than just the so-called digital divide, the access to the internet. Here we're talking knowledge of what, quite frankly, are fairly arcane issues even for practicing lawyers in many cases. I did a little experiment with my students at Harvard, and I asked them to go find some documents on 2 agencies' websites from their rulemaking dockets. Both the EPA and the Department of Transportation have online docket systems where you can, sitting in Peoria, find anything about a particular rule. Well, I asked them, I gave them rules that were covered in the media, okay? And I sort of simulated, well, okay, you're reading something in a newspaper, you want to go find out about it. And I said, and these were fairly sophisticated students who have fairly sophisticated, familiarity with the internet and how to search on it. And only half of them could, within the designated period of time that I gave them, only half of them could find the documents. So we have a much more fundamental problem than just internet access. It's also making information accessible online. It's also making knowledge of the regulatory process more widespread. It's as if we were to expect that suddenly, auto parts dealers put their inventories online and let anybody anywhere order auto parts and expect that suddenly we would all be changing our carburetors. No. We wouldn't, and when we're not going to get that with regulatory policy making either, perhaps ever, but certainly not until you deal with this deeper knowledge issue.
Something. I think we have time. Sure.
I'm Judge Luke. I'm with the North Carolina Rules Review Commission. So I'm a lot more familiar with North Carolina and state rulemaking than the federal rulemaking. But along the lines of a lot of these comments, I think there is a value to the e-rulemaking and the more of the involvement of people. I think the information value is somewhat more than zero on that, but it may not be very high. But one of the things that, and one of the commenters a little while ago was alluding to this, that we can't ignore the fact or lose sight of the fact that this rulemaking is not occurring in a vacuum by the rule makers often it's coming as a result of what they have been told to do by, in our case, the state legislature or Congress. And so for the 3,000 metal shops, you know, Congress may have told EPA, put pollution limits on the volatile organic compounds coming out of these places. You know, the 3,000 comments may say, don't do this, partly because they don't understand where the law is coming from, that it's coming from Congress and not the EPA. So EPA has no choice in that. They can't say, all right, we won't do it. But they can respond, and at least this is my experience on the state level, by saying, we're not going to make that, we're going to phase in the limits on volatile organic compounds. We realize now we can't do it next year, but we will do it over the next 5 years. You know, and this is what you have to do. I could go on and on about that, but I think there is quite a level where the agencies are limited in the response that they can make to the public's response. They have to do some things sometimes.
These two comments relate to each other, though, because they both have to do with a sort of fundamental, you know, is there a new responsibility? Maybe it's always been there, but is there, because there's a new capacity to communicate the role of the agencies and the role of individuals, with that new capacity, is there a new responsibility to do a really good job at communicating that on and off the digital divide? And I would say yes, that this is one of the core responsibilities, not just this commenting.
So you want to amend the APA to no longer
Yes.
require a concise statement at the front, but in fact a sort of a civic education section at the header of every NPRM and final rule.
Actually,
I don't know. Yes.
I don't know. I think you're putting her in a difficult situation to say amending the APA. I think agencies can do this without amending the APA. In fact,
Sure, the FDA is the leader, right? I mean,
I've been working with the OMB on the design of this new federal docket management system so that it will be easier for people to get access to information. You can't just assume. It goes back to your point, Michael, about implementation matters. It may be a truism, seem trite, but it does. It matters how we're going to design. We can design these systems to be more educative or less so.
Well, we have a couple more hands, but we are out of our allotted time, so I want to thank our panelists very much and invite people to come up afterwards if they have any further questions. Thanks a lot.
Enjoy that.
great. Other great crowd. Listen, the zero is not low.